Have you ever admired someone for their incredible wisdom only to watch in disbelief as they made the most foolish decisions of their life? Picture this, a towering mountain peak gleaming in golden sunlight representing the pinnacle of human achievement. Then imagine a single crack appearing in that magnificent summit. Small at first, almost unnoticeable. But over time, that tiny fissure spreads, widening into a chasm that splits the entire mountain in half, sending it crashing down into the valleys below. This is the story of Solomon, a man who possessed wisdom that attracted queens from distant lands, who built a temple that was considered one of the ancient world's greatest wonders, who ruled over a kingdom that stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates River. Yet this same man, blessed with divine wisdom, would make choices so catastrophically wrong that they would tear his kingdom apart and echo through generations. But this isn't just ancient history. This is a timeless warning about the difference between having wisdom and walking in obedience, a distinction that could change everything about how you navigate success, relationships, and the critical decisions that define your life. The foundation, a wise beginning. Our story begins in the halls of power, where the echoes of King David's reign still reverberate through the corridors of Jerusalem. The great warrior king is dead, and his son Solomon has ascended to the throne of Israel. But unlike his father who conquered through the sword, Solomon would conquer through something far more powerful: wisdom. Picture a young king, perhaps no more than 20 years old, suddenly thrust into ruling a vast empire. The weight of the crown feels heavier than gold, the responsibility more crushing than any physical burden. In this moment of overwhelming pressure, Solomon does something that would define his early reign. He asks for the right thing. In a dream at Gibeon, when God offers Solomon anything his heart desires, the young king doesn't ask for wealth, long life, or victory over his enemies. Instead, he asks for wisdom to govern God's people justly. Kings 3:5-10. This moment is crucial because it reveals something profound about Solomon's initial heart posture. He understood that leadership wasn't about personal gain, but about serving others well. God's response is immediate and generous. Not only does he grant Solomon unparalleled wisdom, but he also promises wealth and honor beyond measure, on one condition: if Solomon walks in obedience to God's ways. The first demonstration of this divine gift comes in a case that would make Solomon legendary throughout the ancient world. Two women stand before the king, both claiming to be the mother of the same infant. One baby has died in the night, and each woman insists the living child is hers. There are no witnesses, no evidence, no way to determine the truth through conventional means. But Solomon sees what others cannot. He calls for a sword and proposes to cut the living baby in half, giving each woman her portion. The courtroom falls silent. One woman agrees to the gruesome solution: better half a child than none at all. But the other woman cries out, "No, give her the living child. Don't kill him." In that moment of desperate love, she reveals herself as the true mother. Solomon's wisdom cuts through deception like a blade through cloth. The real mother would rather lose her child than see him harmed. This single judgment spreads throughout the kingdom like wildfire. Here is a king who can see the heart, who can discern truth from lies, who rules with justice, tempered by compassion. But perhaps Solomon's greatest early achievement wasn't a judgment or a policy. It was a building. The Temple of Jerusalem would become the centerpiece of Israel's worship, a magnificent structure that took 7 years to complete. Cedar wood from Lebanon, gold from Ophir, precious stones from distant lands, no expense was spared. When it was finished, the temple wasn't just a building. It was a statement to the world that Israel's God deserved the very best humanity could offer. The dedication ceremony was unlike anything the world had ever seen. As Solomon prayed, the glory of the Lord filled the temple so powerfully that the priests couldn't even stand to minister. 1 Kings 8:10-11. This was the high point of Solomon's reign, the moment when human wisdom and divine presence came together in perfect harmony. Today's meaning: a strong start doesn't guarantee a glorious finish if we lose sight of our central focus on worship and obedience to God. The golden age, when wisdom attracts the world. What followed was an era of prosperity that would become the stuff of legend. Solomon's wisdom wasn't just theoretical. It was intensely practical. He reorganized the entire kingdom into 12 administrative districts, each responsible for providing food and resources for 1 month of the year. This system distributed the burden of supporting the royal household while ensuring efficient governance throughout the realm. Trade routes that had once been controlled by various tribal groups now came under Solomon's unified control. Caravans from Arabia brought gold, spices, and precious stones. Ships sailed from Ezion-Geber to the mysterious land of Ophir, returning with cargoes worth king's ransoms. The king's wealth grew so vast that silver was considered as common as stones in Jerusalem's King's Tit. 10:27. But it was Solomon's wisdom that truly set him apart. He could speak about trees from the cedar in Lebanon to the hyssop growing out of walls. He could discuss animals, birds, reptiles, and fish, with expertise that amazed scholars from distant lands. 1 Kings 4:30. He composed 3,000 proverbs and wrote over 1,000 songs. His court became a destination for anyone seeking knowledge, understanding, or justice. Then came the visit that would immortalize Solomon's reputation forever. The Queen of Sheba, ruler of a wealthy kingdom in what is now Ethiopia or Yemen, had heard rumors of Solomon's wisdom. But rumors, she knew, could be deceptive. Great rulers throughout history had been masters of propaganda, surrounding themselves with the illusion of greatness while lacking substance. So she came to test him with hard questions, bringing with her a caravan loaded with spices, gold, and precious stones. Picture this scene: a powerful queen, accompanied by a vast retinue, approaching Jerusalem across the desert. The dust clouds raised by her camels and servants could be seen from miles away. This wasn't just a diplomatic visit. It was a test of everything Solomon claimed to be. For days, she questioned Solomon about everything under the sun: philosophy, governance, trade, religion, natural sciences. No topic was off limits. And with each question, Solomon's answers revealed depths of understanding that left her breathless. But it wasn't just his knowledge that impressed her. It was the way that knowledge translated into practical wisdom in every aspect of his kingdom. She observed how his servants conducted themselves, how his officials performed their duties, how justice was administered throughout the land. She saw the magnificent temple, the elaborate palace complex, the sophisticated toy infrastructure that connected every corner of the kingdom. Everything spoke of a mind that could envision grand designs and the organizational skill to bring those visions to reality. When her testing was complete, the Queen of Sheba made a statement that would echo through history. The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdoms is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard. 1 Kings 10, 6-7. This was Solomon at his peak, a man whose reputation was exceeded only by his reality, whose wisdom had created a kingdom that was the envy of the ancient world. Leaders from every nation sought audience with him, bringing gifts and tribute. Israel had become the center of international trade diplomacy and learning. But success, as Solomon would later write in Ecclesiastes, can be a dangerous teacher. It whispers lies about our own importance, about the permanence of our achievements, about the sustainability of our current trajectory. Hidden beneath the golden surface of Solomon's reign, cracks were already beginning to form. The building projects that showcased the kingdom's wealth required enormous resources. The 12 administrative districts weren't just organizing supplies. They were extracting them through increasingly heavy taxation. The foreign laborers brought in for construction projects were joined by Israelites pressed into service. The magnificent lifestyle of the royal court demanded ever-increasing revenues to sustain. Today's meaning, success can blind us to its hidden moral and social costs. Achievements that compromise our principles will eventually undermine our foundation. The seductive path, when compromise becomes system. The descent began not with a dramatic fall, but with what seemed like reasonable decisions. In the ancient world, marriage alliances were the foundation of diplomacy. A king who wanted to secure his borders, establish trade relationships, and maintain peace with neighboring powers, almost inevitably needed to marry into foreign royal families. For Solomon, this wasn't just practical politics, it was essential statecraft. The first foreign marriage was to Pharaoh's daughter, an alliance that brought significant political advantages. Kings 3:1. Egypt was still a major power, and having the Pharaoh as a father-in-law provided security for Israel's southern border. The marriage seemed like a masterstroke of diplomatic wisdom. But then came other alliances, other marriages, Moabite princesses, Ammonite nobility, Edomite royalty, Sidonian daughters. Each marriage brought political benefits, trade advantages, or strategic security. By the end of his reign, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, representing alliances with virtually every significant power in the region. Kings 11:3. Here's where Solomon's story becomes a masterclass in how gradual compromise can corrupt even the wisest heart. These weren't just political arrangements, they were relationships with real people who brought their own religious beliefs, cultural practices, and spiritual commitments into the heart of Israel. At first, Solomon might have assumed his wisdom and faith was strong enough to influence these women rather than be influenced by them. Perhaps he believed he could maintain his devotion to the Lord while allowing his wives to practice their ancestral religions. After all, wasn't religious tolerance a mark of sophisticated leadership? But the human heart doesn't work like a fortress that can keep some influences out while letting others in. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Solomon's perspective began to shift. The exclusive worship of the God of Israel started to feel narrow, provincial, perhaps even diplomatically problematic. Why alienate foreign allies over religious differences? When accommodation could bring such obvious benefits, the theological slide was subtle but devastating. It began with tolerance, allowing foreign wives to worship their gods in private. Then came accommodation, building shrines and high places where these deities could be worshipped more publicly. Eventually, it progressed to participation. Solomon himself burning incense and offering sacrifices to gods his wives had brought from their homelands. Picture the spiritual schizophrenia that must have characterized Solomon's later years. In the morning, he might preside over sacrifices at the temple of the Lord, the magnificent structure he had built to honor the God of Israel. By evening, he could be found at a high place outside Jerusalem offering incense to Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, or making sacrifices to Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, Kings 11:5-8. This wasn't ignorance. Solomon knew exactly what God's law said about such practices. This wasn't cultural confusion. He had been raised in the faith of Israel from childhood. This was the calculated decision of a man who had convinced himself that he could manage multiple loyalties, that his wisdom was sophisticated enough to navigate competing spiritual commitments. The rationalization process that occurs in successful people facing moral compromise is always fascinating and terrifying. Solomon likely told himself that these religious observances were purely ceremonial, political necessities that didn't reflect his true beliefs. He might have reasoned that his foreign wives deserved the respect of seeing their religious traditions honored. Perhaps he convinced himself that all religions contained some truth, and that his broad perspective was actually a sign of enlightened thinking. But here's the crucial theological point that Solomon forgot. The God of Israel isn't just another deity in a pantheon of options. He is the creator of all things, the one who demands exclusive worship not out of petty jealousy, but because he alone is worthy of ultimate allegiance. When Solomon began treating the Lord as one God among many, he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the being who had granted him his wisdom in the first place. Today's meaning: modern idols, power, achievement, pleasure, personal brand, are often more subtle than ancient ones, but just as destructive when they compete with our ultimate loyalty to God. The warning signs. When grace becomes judgment, God's response to Solomon's spiritual adultery wasn't immediate destruction. It was a series of increasingly serious warnings, each offering an opportunity for repentance and course correction. This is how divine patience works. Judgment is never God's first response, but it is always His final one when warnings go unheeded. The first signs of divine displeasure came in the form of external pressures that threatened the stability Solomon had worked so hard to build. Hadad the Edomite, a member of Edom's royal family who had fled to Egypt during David's conquest, suddenly emerged as a significant threat to Israel's southern borders. Kings 11 or 14-22. This wasn't coincidence. it was consequence. At the same time, Rezin, son of Eliada, established himself as a rebel leader in Damascus, constantly harassing Israel's northern territories to kings, these weren't random insurgencies. They were the inevitable result of a kingdom that was losing the divine protection that had made it invincible under David and in Solomon's early years. But the most dramatic warning came through a prophet named Ahijah, who confronted one of Solomon's officials named Jeroboam in a scene that reads like political theater, designed to shock Solomon into recognition of what was at stake. Kings 11:29-39. Picture this encounter. Jeroboam, a capable administrator who had been put in charge of forced labor from the northern tribes, is walking alone on a road outside Jerusalem. Suddenly, the prophet Ahijah appears wearing a new cloak. Without explanation, Ahijah tears the garment into 12 pieces and hands 10 of them to the astonished official. "Take 10 pieces for yourself," Ahijah declares. "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe." The symbolism is unmistakable. The torn cloak represents the coming division of Solomon's kingdom. The 10 pieces given to Jeroboam represent the 10 northern tribes that would be torn away from Davidic rule. The 2 pieces remaining represent Judah and Benjamin, which would stay loyal to Solomon's son for the sake of God's covenant with David. But notice the conditional language in Ahijah's prophecy. This isn't an arbitrary divine decision. It's the inevitable consequence of Solomon's spiritual apostasy. "I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David Solomon's father did." Kings 11:33. The contrast with David is particularly striking. David, despite his moral failures, always returned to wholehearted devotion to the Lord. His adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah were serious sins, but they were exceptions to a pattern of faithfulness, not expressions of a fundamental shift in loyalty. Solomon's idolatry, by contrast, represented a systematic abandonment of exclusive worship of the God of Israel. Even in judgment, yet, however, God's mercy is evident. The kingdom wouldn't be torn away during Solomon's lifetime, but after his death. This gave Solomon time to repent, to reverse course, to return to the exclusive worship that had characterized his early reign. The warning was clear, the consequence was explained, but the door to restoration remained open. Today's meaning: God warns before he judges. Our freedom always comes with responsibility for the consequences of our choices. The bitter harvest. How leadership failures multiply. Solomon died, but his choices lived on. This is perhaps the most sobering aspect of his story, the way individual decisions can echo through generations, affecting people who had no voice in making them. Leadership always has consequences beyond the leader. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, inherited not just a throne, but a kingdom seething with resentment. The heavy taxation, The forced labor, the increasing gulf between the magnificent royal lifestyle and the struggles of ordinary citizens, all of this had created a powder keg of discontent that would explode at the first opportunity. That opportunity came when representatives from the northern tribes approached the new king with what seemed like a reasonable request. "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." 1 Kings 12:4. They weren't asking for revolution. They were asking for reform. They weren't demanding independence. They were requesting reasonable governance. Rehoboam faced a choice that would determine the future of his kingdom. His older advisors, men who had served during Solomon's reign and understood the mounting pressures, urged moderation. "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." 1 Kings 12:7. But the young king rejected this counsel in favor of advice from his contemporaries, men who had grown up in the luxury of Solomon's court and had no understanding of the burdens common people faced. Their recommendation was disastrously tone-deaf. "My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." 1 Kings 12:10-11. The northern tribe's response was swift and decisive. "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel, look after your own house, David." 1 Kings 12. The united kingdom that David had forged and Solomon had ruled was torn apart in a single day. But the tragedy didn't end with political division. Jeroboam, now king of the northern tribes, faced a strategic problem. If his people continued to go to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, their hearts might eventually return to the house of David. His solution was religiously catastrophic. He set up golden calves at Bethel and Dan, telling the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." 1 Kings 12:28. The irony is devastating. The golden calf had been Israel's great apostasy in the wilderness, the sin that had almost brought divine destructions upon the entire nation. Now, a king of Israel was deliberately recreating that apostasy as state policy. He appointed priests who weren't from the tribe of Levi, established festivals that mimicked but replaced the biblical calendar, and created an entire alternative religious system designed to keep his people away from true worship. Picture the spiritual confusion that must have followed. Israelites who wanted to worship the God of their fathers now had to choose between the true temple in Jerusalem, controlled by their political enemies, and convenient shrines in their own territory, established by their own king, but representing a compromise of everything their faith stood for. Many chose convenience over conviction. The division created a domino effect of consequences that would play out over centuries. The northern kingdom, cut off from the temple and corrupted by false worship, would stumble from one bad king to another until it was finally conquered and scattered by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom would survive longer, but would struggle continuously with the tensions between political pragmatism and religious faithfulness that Solomon had introduced. Most tragically godly people in both kingdoms would suffer for decisions they had no part in making. Families would be separated by the political division. The poor would bear the economic burden of maintaining two royal courts instead of one. Future generations would inherit a legacy of spiritual confusion and political instability. Today's meaning. Leadership mistakes compound across generations. Our choices create consequences that extend far beyond our own lives. The complex legacy wisdom without obedience. How do we make sense of Solomon? How do we reconcile the man who wrote much of the book of Proverbs with the man who violated virtually every principle those Proverbs contain? How do we understand a king who built the temple of the Lord and also constructed shrines to foreign gods? Solomon's legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Wisdom and obedience aren't the same thing. It's possible to have profound insight into how life works while consistently choosing to live contrary to that insight. Solomon understood the principles of righteous living well enough to articulate them in memorable proverbs, but knowledge without application becomes merely intellectual exercise. Consider some of the wisdom Solomon recorded in Proverbs, then contrast it with his actual life choices. He wrote, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." Proverbs 3. Yet he consistently relied on political alliances rather than divine guidance. He observed, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Proverbs 4:20. Yet he allowed his heart to be turned away by foreign wives. He warned, "The simple believe anything but the prudent give thought to their steps." Proverbs 14:15. Yet he naively assumed he could manage competing spiritual loyalties. He noted, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a faileth." Proverbs 16:18. Yet his later years were marked by the pride of accomplishment that made him feel exempt from the rules that governed ordinary people. This disconnect reveals something crucial about human nature. We can understand truth intellectually while failing to integrate it into our actual decision-making process. Solomon's wisdom was real. His proverbs remain relevant and helpful thousands of years later. But wisdom without the humility that leads to obedience becomes a dangerous tool that can justify almost any compromise. The book of Ecclesiastes, also attributed to Solomon, reads like the journal of a man who had tried everything life had to offer and found it ultimately empty. Meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Ecclesiastes 1:2. This isn't the cynicism of someone who never achieved anything. It's the disillusionment of someone who achieved everything and discovered that achievement without righteousness leaves the soul empty. Yet, even in Ecclesiastes, glimpses of Solomon's original wisdom shine through. The book's conclusion brings us back to what matters most. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Ecclesiastes 12:13-14. It's as if Solomon, looking back on his life from the vantage point of experience, wanted to warn future generations. Don't make my mistake. Don't think that wisdom can substitute for obedience. Don't assume that success gives you permission to compromise your fundamental commitments. Today's meaning? Wisdom without obedience is incomplete. True legacy requires both understanding truth and consistently living it out. Lessons for modern leaders avoiding Solomon's traps. Solomon's story isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror that reflects the temptations and challenges faced by anyone in a position of influence today. Whether you're leading a family, managing a team, running a business, or serving in ministry, Solomon's Rise and Fall offers crucial insights for navigating success without losing your soul. The temptation of incremental compromise. Modern leaders face the same gradual slide that destroyed Solomon. It rarely starts with dramatic moral failures. It begins with small accommodations that seem reasonable at the time. A business leader might begin by slightly inflating numbers to meet investor expectations. A pastor might start avoiding controversial biblical topics to maintain numerical growth. A parent might begin compromising family values to avoid conflict with teenage children. Each compromise makes the next one easier. Each accommodation establishes a new baseline of acceptability. Before long, you're somewhere you never intended to go, doing things you once would have condemned, justifying behaviors that your earlier self would have found unthinkable. Solomon's marriage alliances teach us that we can't compartmentalize our values. The political was personal, the personal was spiritual, and the spiritual affected everything else. In our interconnected lives, there are no neutral zones where our core commitments don't apply. The seduction of success. Success is perhaps the most dangerous test of character because it feels so much like blessing. When things are going well, when resources are abundant, when recognition is flowing, it's easy to assume that God approves of our methods and that our current trajectory is sustainable indefinitely. Solomon's prosperity convinced him that he could handle influences that would have destroyed a lesser man. His wisdom made him confident that he could navigate competing loyalties without losing his way. His achievements created a sense of invincibility that made divine warnings seem irrelevant. Modern leaders must recognize that success can insulate us from feedback, surround us with people who tell us what we want to hear, and create an echo chamber where our own voice sounds like wisdom, even when it's leading us astray. The higher we rise, the more intentional we must become about seeking truth-telling voices and maintaining accountability structures. The cost of leadership isolation. Solomon's later years seem marked by increasing isolation from the people he ruled. The magnificent palace complex, the elaborate court ceremonies, the foreign wives and their customs, all of this created distance between the king and ordinary Israelites. He lost touch with the burden his policies were placing on common people. Leadership naturally creates some separation. But a dangerous isolation occurs when leaders become so removed from the consequences of their decisions that they stop considering the human cost of their choices. Modern leaders must work actively to maintain connection with those most affected by their decisions. This means regular interaction with frontline employees, not just senior management. It means listening to customer complaints personally, not just reading summary reports. It means understanding how family decisions affect each family member, not just assuming that what works for parents will work for children. The necessity of spiritual discipline. Solomon's spiritual disciplines seem to have weakened as his external responsibilities increased. The young king who sought God's wisdom in a dream became an older ruler who relied primarily on his own understanding. The man who prayed so powerfully at the temple's dedication became someone who offered incense to foreign gods. Success can make spiritual practices feel less necessary. When things are going well, prayer can seem like something we do when we have extra time rather than the foundation of wise decision-making. Bible study can feel like an academic exercise rather than essential nourishment for the soul. Corporate worship can become a duty to be fulfilled rather than a source of strength and perspective. The busier we become, the more crucial these practices become. The more successful we are, the more we need the humility that comes from regular acknowledgement of our dependence on God. The more complex our decisions become, the more we need the wisdom that comes from saturating our thinking with biblical truth, building accountability systems. Solomon's tragedy might have been prevented if he had maintained strong accountability relationships, but success often erodes the accountability structures that helped create that success in the first place. When we're doing well, advice can feel like interference. When we're recognized as experts, questions can feel like challenges to our competence. Effective accountability requires intentional cultivation of relationships with people who have both the wisdom to recognize problems and the courage to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. These relationships must be established before they're needed, because it's almost impossible to create them in the midst of crisis. This means surrounding yourself with people who share your fundamental values, but aren't dependent on you for their security. It means creating regular opportunities for honest assessment of your decisions and their consequences. It means empowering others to speak into your life even when, especially when, you don't want to hear what they have to say. Today's meaning: personal integrity requires systematic attention to spiritual disciplines, accountability, relationships, and regular evaluation of whether our practices align with our stated values. Common misconceptions. Clearing up the confusion. Solomon's story raises questions that have troubled readers for thousands of years. Let's address some of the most common misconceptions and concerns. If God gave Solomon wisdom, why did he still... This question misunderstands both the nature of divine gifts and human responsibility. God's gifts don't override human choice. They enhance human capacity. Solomon received the ability to discern truth and make wise decisions, but he retained the freedom to ignore his own discernment and choose foolishly. Wisdom isn't a magical protection against bad choices. It's a tool that must be consistently applied. Solomon knew better. His Proverbs prove that he understood the principles of righteous living, but knowledge without obedience becomes condemnation rather than blessing. The gift of wisdom brought with it increased responsibility. Because Solomon knew more clearly what was right, his failures carried greater weight. This is why James warns, "Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly." James 3:1. Doesn't success prove God's approval? This is perhaps the most dangerous misconception in Solomon's story. The prosperity of his early reign did reflect divine blessing, But continued prosperity doesn't necessarily indicate continued approval. God's patience allows consequences to develop gradually, giving opportunities for repentance before judgment falls. Success can continue even after we've begun making poor choices because of momentum, because of systems we established during better times, or because God's mercy delays consequences to provide opportunities for course correction. The fact that something is working in the short term doesn't prove it's sustainable or right in the long term. Moreover, success must be evaluated by the right metrics. Solomon's kingdom was economically prosperous but spiritually compromised. His policies generated wealth but created social tensions that eventually tore the nation apart. True success must be measured not just by immediate results, but by long-term consequences. Not just by external achievements, but by character development. Why do consequences extend to multiple generations? This question reflects our individualistic culture's difficulty with the concept of corporate responsibility. But leadership decisions inevitably affect others, and the consequences of those decisions can play out over decades. Solomon's religious compromises created confusion that affected how future generations understood their relationship with God. His political alliances established precedents that future kings would follow. His economic policies created structural problems that would burden the kingdom long after his death. This isn't unfair, it's simply realistic. Parents' choices affect their children's opportunities and challenges. Leaders' decisions create the environment in which future leaders must operate. Business owners' practices establish cultural norms that outlast their own involvement. Understanding this multi-generational impact should motivate us toward greater responsibility, not toward despair about unfairness. We have the opportunity to leave positive legacies just as surely as negative ones. The same dynamics that can transmit problems across generations can also transmit blessings, the enduring message. How to keep your heart when you're on top. Solomon's story ultimately asks one crucial question. How do you maintain faithfulness when you have every reason to think you don't need to? How do you preserve humility when everyone is telling you how wise you are? How do you keep worshiping God when you could easily become a god yourself? The answer lies not in avoiding success, but in understanding its proper place. Success is a tool, not a destination. Wisdom is a gift to be stewarded, not a trophy to be displayed. Leadership is an opportunity to serve, not a platform for self-promotion. The difference between Solomon's early years and his later decline can be summarized in a single word: worship. When Solomon's highest priority was honoring God, his wisdom flourished and his kingdom prospered. When other priorities began competing for that central place, everything else began to unravel. This is why the book of Deuteronomy, which Solomon certainly knew well, contains specific instructions for kings. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll, a copy of this law taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Deuteronomy 17:18-20. The prescription for successful leadership is daily immersion in God's truth, regular reminder of our dependence on Him, and intentional cultivation of humility toward those we serve. These practices don't guarantee perfect decisions, but they create the conditions where wisdom can flourish and where course corrections can happen before small compromises become massive failures. Solomon's legacy is ultimately one of warning and hope. The warning is clear. No amount of wisdom, success, or divine blessing makes us immune to the consequences of disobedience. The hope is equally clear. God's desire is not to condemn us, but to guide us toward decisions that bring blessing to ourselves and others. The question Solomon's story leaves us with isn't whether we'll face temptations to compromise. We will. It's not whether success will bring challenges to our character. It will. The question is whether we'll learn from Solomon's example in time to make different choices. Will we recognize that wisdom without obedience is ultimately foolishness? Will we understand that success without faithfulness is ultimately failure? Will we realize that building impressive legacies means nothing if we lose our souls in the process? Solomon started well. He received incredible gifts, built amazing things, and achieved remarkable success. But his ending tells a different story of opportunities wasted, relationships broken, and a kingdom divided. Your story is still being written. The choices you make today about worship, about compromise, about what you'll allow to compete with your ultimate loyalties. These choices are determining not just your own future, but the inheritance you'll leave for those who come after you. The mountain peak of success gleams golden in the sunlight. But remember, even the smallest crack can eventually bring down the mightiest mountain. Guard your heart. Maintain your worship and choose faithfulness over convenience. Because in the end, how you finish matters more than how you start, and what you worship determines everything else about how you live. The choice is yours. What will your legacy be?